When it comes to comics, if there is one person that you should definitely never ever get on the wrong side of, it's gonna be Batman. Because this guy won't just beat you up, sometimes he will go one step further and utterly embarrass you in some pretty horrible ways. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 worst things that Batman did to villains. Number 10. Bootface. Batman and Robin, number 10. So as we all know, Batman doesn't kill, sure, but that doesn't stop him from inflicting permanent wounds now, does it? In Batman and Robin, this idea was explored through a group of criminals that had been permanently damaged by Batman or Robin. There was Smush, which was 3 men merged into one monstrosity at the hands of Robin, Scallop, who had one of Batman's arm spikes go through her ear, Bathead, a guy with a batarang lodged into his skull, and Bootface, who was kicked in the face by Batman and had the imprint melted into his skin. The melting part came as the result of Bootface using a flamethrower at the time of the incident, leaving the villain with some of the worst facial scarring in comic history and hence arguably making him the worst of the aforementioned group. Number 9. Taunting Bane. Batman, number 13. Though obviously completely far worse than Bruce, there are times when one can see at least why villains are so cruel in their treatment of the Bat. This is one such instance, as in the recent I Am Suicide story arc, Batman illegally invades Bane's prison kingdom of Santa Prisca, masterfully deceives the villain, has Catwoman break his back, and then steals the Psycho Pirate, another villain who had been using his emotion-manipulating abilities to help Bane overcome his dependency on Venom. All of that is pretty tame in comparison to what Bane had previously done to Bruce though, but it's what Batman does before leaving that makes this completely cruel. He taunts him. With but a few words, Batman humiliates a man that has just had his back broken and forces said man back into his drug addiction. And here I was thinking that superheroes were supposed to be anti-recreational drug use. Number 8. Using Mr. Freeze as an emotional punching bag. Batman, number 53. Bruce was understandably upset when Selina broke off their wedding. However, his means of distracting from his sadness were a little less reasonable. This was because his chosen method wasn't to talk about it or maybe take a few nights off from being Batman. No, instead he sought out Mr. Freeze and beat him to an icy pulp before forcing the villain to confess to a murder that he hadn't even committed. There isn't any question that Bruce knew of his innocence. He's the world's greatest detective after all, and soon afterwards he bribed himself onto the jury of Freeze's trial to ensure that Victor wasn't further punished for something that he simply hadn't done. All in all, that was not cool, Batman. Number 7. Turning Ra's al Ghul to ash. Batman Annual number 8. As permanent injuries go, being turned to ash is probably one of the worst, and in spite of Batman's arrogant denial of blatant facts, it's definitely also murder. But this is the fate that Ra's al Ghul suffers at the hands of Batman, where the Caped Crusader heroically uses the villain's technology, which was originally intended to purge the Earth, to disintegrate the head of the demon. And to ensure his total annihilation, Batman then ejects his ashes into space. And Batman does all of this in front of Talia al Ghul, Ra's daughter, just for added cruel points. This causes Talia to leave Bruce, but Batman doesn't really seem to care. He just swings off into the sunset, completely content with his efforts. Number 6. Hanging someone. Batman number 1. If it's debatable whether or not disintegrating Ra's al Ghul was murder because he has the Lazarus Pit, then Batman hanging a mental patient who most certainly does not have access to similar technology is most definitely murder. Now, the early days of Batman definitely has a lot of blood on his hands, due to how the character's no-killing rule did not exist at all at this point. So seeing this iteration of the Caped Crusader kill isn't really too out of the ordinary. It's just that this particular murder is extremely brutal. I mean, Batman not only hangs the poor guy, but parades him about by dangling him from the Batplane and even remarks that he's probably better off this way. Do you know what, Bruce? I'm not quite sure he is. Number 5. Killing the monk in his sleep. Detective Comics number 32. Now this one is also unquestionably murder. By no means a monk by traditional standards, the monk is a Golden Age villain that most will never have heard of, and the reason for that is because Batman straight up killed him in his sleep way back in Detective Comics number 32. In typical early Batman fashion, Batman remains eerily calm and cold throughout this story, sneaking into the monk's knockoff Dracula castle and evading all of the villain's traps, before then opening the monk's coffin and then swiftly shooting him in the head. And the woman that he killed the monk for, who was also his fiancée at the start of the story, forgets him after having the curse on her broken, which is a ton of overkill. Number 4. Kicking a guy into a vat of acid. Detective Comics number 27. I tell you what, how early Batman was never mistaken for a supervillain, I will never know. In this instance, Batman punches a killer with such force that the criminal crashes through the metal barrier and falls into a vat of acid. Now, going through a metal barrier would be painful enough, but then having one's entire body covered in industrial-grade acid? Well, that is just plenty ouch. Once again, though, Batman sees his efforts as completely reasonable, declaring this a fitting end for his kind, which is rather ironic, seeing as the guy that he threw into the acid had planned to do the same to his intended victim, making the supposed hero actually no better than the villain. This definitely killed the guy as well, but not before he suffered some intense pain, of course. Number 3. Torturing Penguin. Batman The Dark Knight number 2. Now, Penguin is one of the few Batman villains that seems to know when to answer Batman's questions. He might not be completely truthful, but he's smart enough to often reveal what he knows rather than taking a beating. The opposite, though, was true of David Fincher's Batman The Dark Knight, in which Penguin wasn't overtly cooperative, and it seems that the villain could not have chosen a worse time to not answer Batman's questions, as the Dark Knight was so desperate for answers that he immediately began breaking bones and then more bones. It may not be quite on the same level as jamming sharpened sticks underneath somebody's nails, but breaking each of the man's limbs is undoubtedly torture, and definitely one of the worst things that Batman has also done to a villain. Number 2. Torturing the Mad Hatter and leaving him to drown. Batman The Dark Knight number 21. In a series of the same name as the one from the previous entry, yet with a completely different creative team, Batman gets angry after a friend of his is killed by the Mad Hatter. This anger is to such a degree that when he tracks down the Hatter, the villain is treated to the beating of his life. And it gets so bad that Alfred even pleads with Bruce to stop, and Batman throws the Mad Hatter through a bunch of his Alice in Wonderland themed scenery, then proceeds to punch him to a near-death state, before finally throwing him in a nearby lake. Ultimately, Alfred convinces Bruce to pull the Hatter from the water, but it takes an uncomfortably long time. The most twisted element of this scene is that Batman seems to enjoy it as he greets the Mad Hatter with a wide grin before carrying out his onslaught. And number 1, driving Joe Chill to suicide. Batman number 673. Regardless of whether Thomas and Martha Wayne were as horrible as they were presented in Joker or as flawlessly as they were depicted usually in comics, killing them and inflicting such massive trauma on their child is pretty horrible. Throughout Batman number 673, Batman visits Joe Chill every single night. He doesn't harm the criminal, instead only taking down his guards while quietly threatening him. Finally, Batman hands Joe the gun that he used to kill his parents, loaded and with one bullet in the chamber, and the outcome of this is pretty obvious. Some may argue that psychologically torturing Joe Chill is an appropriate punishment for what he did to Bruce, yet doing so to the extent that he felt suicide was the only way out, that is undeniably a disproportionate response. And there we go, my friends. Those were the 10 worst things Batman did to villains. I hope that you enjoyed this. Well, either way, let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.